here's my story. So I've been working on water issues since the late 90s. I got interested in water issues after a 2-year backpacking trip where I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do with my life? And I backpacked independently and kind of started to see how water interacts with conflict in the Middle East and poverty in Eastern and Southern Africa and companies and how industry uses water and pollution, seeing wastewater pipes. And so I got really interested in water issues and privatization. And over the last close to, I'm inching up on my 20-year mark, working with private companies and foundations and governments and donor agencies all around a variety of different water issues. But one of the things I did from 2007 to 2012 is I was a founding member of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's water and sanitation program. So we went through all of the trying to figure out and landscape what should the foundation do. And I say that because here I am on a sailboat a couple of years ago, sailing with some of my former colleagues. And there had been an international sort of convening, right? So a bunch of people were in town, and one of my former colleagues said, hey, I've got a sailboat, let's all go sailing. And so, here we have a group of water, it's kind of like a joke, right? A bunch of water experts get on a sailboat. We get to the marina, and our host said, could you all use the toilet before we go on the boat because the head is kind of broken? And you guys have been working on fecal sludge markets for the last few years, so when we get back to port, I'm gonna need your help actually emptying it because I've kind of been avoiding emptying it for a few weeks, right? And so we all were like, great, sailing trip, this is gonna be great. But of course we'll help you. So the thing is that when we got out on the water, our conversation naturally turned to water and sanitation and water security and sub-Saharan Africa and so forth. But I had one colleague, and this is someone who I've known for a really long time, and we got in this really sort of ferocious debate because he said, for the love of God, I just don't understand why we can't just dump this holding tank. I mean, man, this stuff's been festering for a couple of weeks. Like, can't we just dump it over into Puget Sound? And we got into a really lively debate about it because I was horrified. I think it was a 14-gallon tank. So it wasn't that much sewage, my colleague protested. This photograph was taken kind of, this is my being nice grin after that conversation had ended. But for me, and this is a photo I've taken from a ferry boat, I mean, think of the orcas, right? Gosh, we're gonna dump this raw sewage over into the Puget Sound, are you kidding? Resident orcas out where I live, so I live outside of Seattle, they have 200 times the pollution, right? The toxicity that humans have in their bodies. When an orca whale beaches, if it dies and happens to beach, it is a toxic waste mine, right? And it has to be treated with people in like hazmat suits. That's how polluted these beautiful creatures, their bodies are. And all of this toxicity is human caused, right? And let's acknowledge, right, we're talking about water security and water scarcity, and the Puget Sound is a saltwater estuary, but it's fed by the fresh water that flows from the Cascade Mountains up there in the background, and the Olympics. Those are the Olympics, the Cascades. And this is water that flows through farmland and is used by industry and cities and towns all along the way, interacting with humans and all the things that make our economy great and build our societies and so forth. But it's picking up all the pollutants and the waste that we generate through our activities. And the salmon, that is the main diet for these orca whales, also are picking up these pollutants, and salmon have pretty toxic bodies too. And the reality, I guess in our daily lives, we don't really see this pollution. I look at the Puget Sound and I see this gorgeous body of water with snow-capped mountains in the background, and I'm proud to call it home. And we don't often think about the quality of that source, right? It's changing based on how we live as people, as an urbanizing place with more roads, more impermeable pavement, right? As houses get bigger on their land plots, as companies are growing their footprints, as we fly, as we use vehicles, single passenger cars in Seattle to enhance our mobility. This is part of our lives in the 21st century. So I really felt kind of offended by this idea of we're just gonna dump raw sewage into the Puget Sound. But the reality is my colleague was also right. So in truth, Victoria, Canada, which is just up the way, it doesn't treat its wastewater. It just dumps raw sewage into the Straits of Juan de Fuca. And in fact, actually, 6 months or so after this debate, in one of the sewage treatment plants that's actually right close to where we're sailing here, it actually had an explosion, like a complete system failure, and 400 million gallons of raw sewage entered the Puget Sound, right? Our ecosystems can absorb this kind of pollution and process it and so forth. Like, the solution to pollution is dilution, as engineers like to say. In the US, to echo what you were saying about regulations, I mean, it was really the Clean Water Act in the 1970s. The Clean Water Act happened in the 1940s, but in the 70s there were some amendments that gave some financial incentives for cities to invest in wastewater treatment. That's really when we started doing wastewater treatment in cities. And the treatment was a one-way process, so consider it's wastewater as opposed to water recovery, as Buzz was talking about, which is where we are thinking about in the 21st century. In Europe, it was the EU Water Framework Directive, which I worked on, and I'm not that old, right? Or I'd like to think that I'm not that old. So it's not really that long ago that we started changing our ethics, right, around how we're using water and treating it in cities. So what I want you to appreciate, right, is we're kind of maybe at the end cusp of an era which is really unique in the human experience, in that our water issues have been invisible to us, right? We can just dump stuff into the water. We can dump our motor oil down stormwater drains, right? We can turn on the tap and we get hot water and cold water. It's there, and it's become invisible to us. And our society is structured that way, right? We have these large centralized forms of infrastructure that Buzz was talking about, which have done so much to develop our human capacity, right? All the dynamism of cities and industry and our economic growth. A lot of that is kind of undergirded by water. But it depends on this system of infrastructure and policies and financing and technologies and institutions. And I think this is a really important piece. Institutions that were designed and engineered in the 20th century when there was a perception that water was abundant. And for the most part, these systems worked, right? During times of drought or flooding, generally, there were effects, but they were short-lived, and there was a resiliency, right, where you could bounce back to normal and you'd have business as usual again. Business as usual consumption of water and business as usual water pollution. In the 21st century, now that we're in our kind of encroaching on our second decade, business as usual isn't sufficient anymore. Between climate change and population growth and the increased pollution of our activities, it's not sufficient, right? And we kind of need new ways of working. So for me, right, working with low-income utilities, I used to do a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, helping utilities and working on donor projects. To me, I used to push this idea of water should be invisible. It should be this gold standard. It should be like it is in OECD countries. But I don't believe that anymore. I think that those are two polarities, and we actually have a lot to learn from each other, from communities where there are 3 billion people who don't have safe and sustainable water services. It's not just the 800 million who have to walk 30 minutes for a tap. And there are closer to 5 billion, I'm looking at Janelle, 5+ billion people who don't have access to safe sanitation. And I think it's well over 1 billion people who openly defecate, right? They have no access to any toilet, which has dignity issues, has privacy issues, and certainly environmental and ecosystem health problems. So this is a chart that just shows water scarcity throughout the year. And as you're looking at this chart, and I'm going to leave it up for a few minutes, I want you to think about this invisibility, because it's not just a perception. It's not just a psychological thing of, oh, right, I'm not really factoring water into my life. Think about and consider that governments and companies kind of view water primarily when it comes to their budgeting and their kind of operations. It's really about the infrastructure that's required to capture, transport, and store water from its source for their use, right, for various use, treating it. So because water doesn't actually, it's really cheap. To actually purchase water is very, very inexpensive relative to any other input, but the cost to actually transport it and treat it and use it, that's what we're talking about oftentimes when we're talking about water. So even for water intensive, uses, we're not really talking about water. The water itself is invisible because it's free. It's as apparent, it's invisible in cities, right? So Buzz's photograph of the LA River, right? It's invisible. What we see was a storm drain and lots of concrete. It's invisible in our municipal finance system where, believe it or not, this series actually did this research where water scarcity risk isn't priced. It's not accounted for by underwriters for municipal finance. So you can get a bond for a municipal water project that doesn't even account for the fact that there could be drought, right? Water is invisible. It's also invisible, largely invisible, in our discussions of trade and trade flows and national security, where we talk about things like food prices and triggering, with the Arab Spring, how food prices are there. Only later did we start seeing stories about the 4-year drought, right, in Syria, and how drought actually is connected with food prices, which makes sense in retrospect, right? But water has been largely invisible to all of these issues. Look at the mass migration of populations, right, that Europe is experiencing. In the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of migration happening within sub-Saharan Africa too, with 4 famines happening right now, right? But we're talking about the famine, less about the drought. And when we talk about the drought, it oftentimes is in these policy terms. We're not really thinking about water insecurity of, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who goes to, let's assume that you have a tap, and you turn it on and nothing comes out. What would that mean for your life, right? And for your livelihood? So the good news is water is becoming visible, right? As we've seen in the presentations this morning. It's starting to gain traction in the news. Good reporting is happening. There's really great investigative journalism happening. And I'm seeing water kind of as a thread pulling through around stories about shrinking lakes. Like in the New Yorker this week, there's a story about Lake Chad. There are these connections in terms of climate change and water. We're starting to see this more. And it's not just about water and humans' use of water, but also the ecosystems, right? And the ecosystem health, this idea of collapse, this idea of, oh my goodness, we're living beyond our thresholds. The stories are starting to happen. We're talking about it today, right? Connecting the dots between water scarcity and national as well as economic security. The bad news is, water security is something that is really something we need to address urgently. This is an urgent issue. It's not just a projection of into the future, it's today. This climate whiplash, I love that idea. It's more apparent, it's more urgent. And part of the challenge is that we don't know yet really what to do about it. There's not a silver bullet solution. There's not going to be a single answer. There's not going to be a single institution that is going to resolve this issue. And I would argue that the institutions that we have to address water security, they aren't well designed to meet the needs of the 21st century. So, just in the last couple of months, I've participated in a number of debates about whether water security is the symptom or the cause, right? Do we need to focus on water to address water security? Or do we need to be looking at things like, city management and military strategy? Is water security and water scarcity really ultimately about sort of the pitfalls of consumer capitalism? And if we're going to talk about addressing water security and water scarcity, do we really need to ask hard questions about how our economy is structured and how our global economy is structured? Is this really an issue about peak humans? If we only had, if instead of 8.5 billion people projected to live on Earth, in the next 15 years, if we somehow could reduce population growth, is that something? So when we talk about water, are we talking about water infrastructure, or are we talking about all these other things? So I've heard also a lot of optimism, and we heard some today in terms of solutions that, there's a mix of engineering and technology, and that we'll have kind of better water pricing, and we can create markets, and I believe that all of that is true. But I also want to acknowledge that we have stagnant levels of research and of investment into basic research. There's so much that we don't even know about water flows. We don't know how surface water and underground water, like groundwater, a lot of the confluence between those two things. We have models for watersheds, but our data we're just at the cusp of beginning to get better data about water. So even though we're surrounded by water, our bodies are water, there's so much that we don't know. And there aren't a lot of funders and a lot of investment into understanding those things. So yes, we have this problem, yes, we have solutions, but we don't have a whole lot of money going toward it. And I think, Buzz, your slide about the patents, right, and clean energy, clean tech, there's a gap here. We need to fix that too. And we also have to fix our mentality that building new infrastructure is a solution and ribbon cutting without actually maintaining it. So, the American Society of Civil Engineers puts our infrastructure in the United States as sort of a D, generally, a grade D, because we don't maintain the infrastructure that we have. So, when you look at these cost estimates for how much we need, it's worth asking the question, is that for the 20th century infrastructure that we need it? Or, does that address our 21st century solutions where we actually are incentivized to maintain the actions that the investments that we make? So meanwhile, we have another billion people coming to Earth in the next 15 years. Most of that population growth is going to happen in cities, in low-income areas that are already facing significant water stress. So think about that from an economic perspective, from a security perspective. I've already mentioned the numbers of people who don't have access to reliable water services. And please consider that 1.4 million people, children under the age of 5, die from preventable diarrhea. It's a lot of people and a lot of challenges. I think, I'm going to take a different tack in terms of my solutions to this challenge, because I think there are tons of statistics and stories that we can share, but I want to turn this back to you, as we start going into our conference, right? I know many of you work on water issues, many of you don't, and it's so great to see you here to learn about how water security affects our lives. Because the crux of it is this: we don't know how to solve the problem of water scarcity, I would argue. And again, as I've just said, I'm not even sure that the problem is water scarcity, or if the problem, if we're solving for a problem, is something else. We're still in many cases and in many spaces of the professional field trying to figure out how to characterize the problem. So as I said, the solution isn't just going to be about increasing water prices or new technologies, although it will be that. Those will be necessary. But I think we also need to start thinking about what is water's value to us, right? Not just water's utility, not just how can we use water, but what does it mean in terms of our human experience here? And I think that that's something that we all can do. We can all kind of pause and reflect a little bit on that, because we are professionals working in our various fields. We're voting citizens in our community. So Kirsten was saying that there are there's things happening in the legislature. It's not just companies who can go and speak to that. We're also citizens who vote in a democracy, right? We have a voice to say. We don't have to be experts to make our voices heard. And we're global citizens, right? Many of us travel around the world. We, in our consumption, in our relationships, and so forth, we are global citizens interacting with this wider world. So all of us have some control and responsibility for how we value water. And I put up this slide because I just want to leave you with, these are some examples of how water is used in our society, right? Water for firefighting. We had devastating fires in Santa Rosa, right? This is from from Idaho, where this was a photograph from a local newspaper where this town had to really make some tough decisions about whether to draw down its reservoir in a time of significant drought to put out fires. So how do you value water in that instance? This is my daughter, who's drinking tap water. And I took the photo around the same time of the lead, right? The Michigan, the lead and Flint. What values are expressed by my daughter, me feeling safe giving my daughter tap water, right? This is the Elwha Dam in Washington State, where you see some Chinook salmon who are desperate to spawn, and they can't spawn because of a dam. The dam has been removed. It's a major success story for reclamation, right? But what values are expressed where we value electricity for a very small paper mill over 5 different, it's the only river in the Olympics that has all 5 species of salmon and, is a heritage site for Native Americans, for the S'Klalams. This is a piece, water is a spiritual value, and Buzz, I'm so glad that you spoke to that earlier today. Water is prominent in our religions, right? And our spiritual practices and our culture. And I think oftentimes when we think of, solutions as water markets and we'll just, price water and it'll be an economic good, let's not lose sight today in our conversations about water's social value and what it means to people, how refreshing it is, right? To shower, to actually have a bath, right? To swim, to enjoy a water pulse, in a place that normally would be dry. Water is also super important for commerce as well as for agriculture. And there are choices reflected in all of these photographs. So I want you to think, how might these change in terms of how might your values change in a time of abundance, or in a time, and think of abundance not just in terms of the quantity of water, but also the quality of water, the reliability of the water, the accessibility of the water, versus in times of scarcity. And I want you to think about that, and I want to encourage you to take those, keep that frame of reference as you engage in the conference today, as you go to these sessions talking about global hotspots and California's water trade and looking at water in cities and thinking about virtual water markets and the solutions. Because please don't lose sight of how we as individuals value our water as really important to shape the design of the solutions that we will come up with in order to meet our needs for the 21st century. So I want to leave you with that. We all can play a role in securing a water future. This is not just about businesses, corporations that are, and just their water footprint. It's not just about government. It's also about us working in all the myriad ways that we engage with water in our lives.